Cannot hear.
Bienvenidos a esta última sesión de nombrar la gestión cultural contemporánea. Y se va a dedicar a gestionar el futuro de los museos hoy. Es un honor tener con nosotros a la doctora Selma Holo. Ella obtuvo su doctorado en Historia del Arte con especialidad en Goya y el arte español de la Universidad de California en Santa Bárbara en 1981. Tras haber realizado estudio en lenguas y literatura españolas. A lo largo de su carrera, Selma ha trabajado en diversos museos y universidades que le han permitido especializarse en museología. Su influencia en el mundo de los museos ha diseminado a través de sus ensayos y docencia. Ha formado muchos estudiantes como curadores y directores de museos. Ha publicado varios libros entre los que destacan Más allá del Prado, Museos e Identidad en una España democrática, Oaxaca en el Crossroad, en el entrecruce, gestionando la memoria, negociando el cambio, Más allá de la taquilla, hablando de los museos y los valores de sostenibilidad, y Remix, cambiando la conversación de los museos en América. Es un orgullo para mí haber trabajado más de 15 años con la doctora Selma Holo. Yo digo que ella es mi gurú, mi gurusa, ella lo sabe. Y que hemos junta en el International Museum Institute que fundó Selma, el Instituto para Estudios Avanzados de Museos. Juntas hemos realizado conferencias, paneles e investigaciones sobre relación de los museos con el mundo cultural. Becas, becas ha otorgado Selma, nos ha otorgado becas y premios a centros de arte para fomentar la experimentación y creando proyectos que enriquecen la oferta cultural. Selma Holo fue curadora de adquisiciones en el Northern Science Museum. Posteriormente se mudó a California para convertirse en profesora en Historia del Arte de tiempo completo en la Universidad del Sur de California, así como directora de los museos de la Universidad del Sur de California. Actualmente estuvo ahí por más de 40 años y recientemente se jubiló para realizar nuevos proyectos y ocupar el cargo de Directora Ejecutiva Emerita de la Universidad de Southern California. Nos acompaña también una joven estudiante de la misma universidad. Ella es Marifer Echavarri y se encuentra trabajando en la tesis El destino de los museos del arte, NFTs, arte digital y sus efectos en la catedral moderna, en la catedral de la modernidad. Muy bienvenidos sean todos ustedes. Muchas gracias por estar aquí y tendremos el honor de escuchar primero a la doctora Selma Holo. Selma, el micrófono es tuyo, por favor.
Thank you, Graciela. The truth is that Graciela is really my guru, and we exchange the best knowledge that we can so as to try to create a kind of wisdom for the future of museums. This conference is thinking about the future of museums, how they're managed, how they're led, and what we can do to be essential, I think, to our publics over the next decades as the world evolves. And when Graciela asked me to participate in this conference, I was in the beginning thinking, oh my gosh, I need to revolutionize my thinking. I need to create new ways of thinking of what museums could be. And then after a while, I thought, no, wait. There's a reason that museums exist in society. Museums exist in society at the will of the people. And I think we all know that museums attract more people, more audiences than all the football games and all the sports games. And they are really extremely well attended. So our question is, how do we both do two things? how do we make the attendance that we do have already? It's not as if museums are not popular. People come to museums. How do we keep that meaningful for the people who come so that they do it not just to be able to say, I went to MUAC today, or I went to the Metropolitan, but that it meant something to me. How do we do that? And then how do we make sure that what exists for the generations who are already going to museums continues to exist in a yet more, aún más meaningful way for the future? So what I did was go back to some work that Graciela and I did together 10, 15 years ago. We developed a book along with our International Museum Institute, which was called Beyond the Turnstile, Making the Case for Museums and Sustainable Values. Okay, let me show it to you in Spanish, because it also, of course, came out in Spanish, Más allá de la taquilla, in both cases having a beautiful cover by Toledo, by our wonderful Francisco Toledo, of blessed memory. And I thought, if what we did was true, if what we did in coming up with the sustainable values was true, then they should be true now, even as they were true a decade ago. However, as I thought about it, if the values are true, that's the core, that's the foundation. But there must be different ways of looking at those values as time goes on. So I decided that what I would do as a kind of a frame for today's conference, for today's session of the conference, is go through those values and see if we can make them speak to today. Because if they're sustainable values, they should be true today, but we should need to amend them, to enlarge them, and to look at them a little bit differently. But when we talk about the values, we should be able to see that they're still relevant. So I'm going to go through today in 10 minutes, the 10 values that we had. It's like a decalogue, a 10 commandments, and see what we can do to see where the value is sustained. The first value that we had was called an obligation to the public trust. And in that value, we had one particular writer whose name was Elazar Barkan, and he talked about cultural justice. We had other writers as well, many other writers from Spain and from Europe and from Mexico and from the United States. But I'm beginning to think now that in that frame of public trust, one of the things that we have to pay more attention to now than ever is cultural justice, because there are people who are coming to museums that don't necessarily have the cultural capital that people in the past brought to museums. And if we're going to have cultural justice, we have to figure out a way that all the values of a museum can be shared, not just among a cultural elite, but a larger population. And I'd like to suggest that as we look at that one value of public trust, of being transparent, and all the things we've talked about for 10 or 15 years, that we underline, que subrayamos, the idea of cultural justice, because I think that in the world that so much needs social justice, that the part that we play as museums is the cultural justice part. I don't think we can really be sure that the homeless have homes. I don't think we can really be sure that the people who do not receive healthcare get healthcare. But what we can do is work toward a cultural equitability. So I'd like to add that as something we need to think about and talk about as we consider the future, spending more time thinking about cultural justice and serving those who have not always been served by museums as well. The second value that we talked about a lot was the primacy of our collections. Now that's something that we need to sustain, because if we have an El Greco, we have to take care of that El Greco. If we have a Zurbaran, we have to take care of that Zurbaran. That's a primacy of a heritage, a legacy. But the collections are being treated differently today as well. And again, we have a phrase in English about don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. No, no tirar a bebé con el agua del baño. We need to still have a primacy of our collections, but our collections need to be looked at and can be looked at differently. I know Marifer, our next speaker, is going to talk about NFTs, but one of the things I've noticed that's happening in all of our great museums all over the world is that NFTs are being used to reproduce some of those incredibly valuable assets from our collections, and they become revenue producing in a way that we've never seen before. So the National Gallery in Britain, for example, has 30 Turners, incredible paintings by Turners that they've turned into NFTs. They are, these NFTs, these digital reproductions are considered a kind of original work of art. They are not the Turners. They're signed by the director. They become something else, but they have categories of either being rare, super rare, ultra rare. If 30 or 100 images are made, the one where 30 images are made will be more valuable and will bring in more revenue to the museum. The people who buy these will then be able to have digital reproductions that they own. This becomes, it's problematic in a value system, but I just want to make sure that we recognize that this is happening, and it's happening everywhere. In contemporary museums, it's being used differently. They can be used as ways of making art, again, that can be distributed and owned or maybe made for digital reproduction. And there are museums that are creating, that are being created right now in Seattle, in Washington, in Galicia, in Spain, that are strictly digital houses, if there is such a thing. I'm not even sure if there's an architectural house. Marifer can speak to us about that, but that are dedicated to NFTs, to creating works of art, distributing works of art, and taking care of the collections newly. So we cannot stop taking care of our collections the way we did in the past, but we can add new ways of thinking about their value in the contemporary world. The next value that we talked about a lot is relevance. And I think we all know that our museums must be relevant if they're going to be important for the future and even for now. And I would just add that we have to think more about generational relevance. What was relevant to a generation that already has its own power, its accumulated capital, its own way of looking at the world might not be as relevant to 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds. And I want to think, and I'm hoping that a conference like this can help us examine the idea of relevance in a way that is meaningful to younger people, and that we will allow them the chance to explain to us what is relevant for them, even as we try to imbue in them the value of protecting the history, the legacies that we've inherited and that we need to protect in the future. And the fourth value that we thought was so important and continues to be important, and it's just a matter of how we interpret these values now. It's not that the values have changed, they are sustainable. The fourth one would be inclusion. How do we include as many people as possible? Now, inclusion overlaps with, of course, cultural justice and with public trust. But again, I think it's a little bit different in that not only do we have to face that we have to make sure that people feel comfortable in museums. All people, from generation to generation, from different educated classes to non-educated classes, it must be a home that is not excluding. So we're going to look at inclusion, and one of the ways that I think we've learned over the last 10, 15 years about creating inclusion isn't just making parties and workshops and whatever. It's how we tell the stories of what we're telling, how we in a history of museum talk about the histories of what it is that the subject of an exhibition would be, how we talk about the the way that we collected things in ways that would be meaningful to not only the people that we're showing the works to, but maybe even include the stories of those from whom the works were taken and in the works of art. So we have to look at inclusion in a way that's much deeper and broader than we did 10, 15 years ago. We have to be able to tell stories that we didn't tell before and not be afraid of them. And I think that that's an important thing. The fifth value that we really pressed on early on was the idea of globalization, that we needed to be open to the world in a way that was really important. And I think we've succeeded in that. I mean, that the digital revolution is very important in that and very powerful in that. And I think even in our art fairs, we've opened our idea of what art can be, I think, to a much broader set of sources and fountains. But I also want to say that one of the things we've learned as we've talked about and succeeded with a lot of globalization is understanding that we need to be very, very respectful of the local as well. And Graciela and I have worked on a prize over the years out of MOAC. And that prize over and over again has looked at the most local areas in Mexico, which were creating wonderfully innovative and creative ways of working with art. And I think that if we do that, then, and if we recognize the local, we will begin to be able to see how it streams into the global and how that can be done without ruining it, without wrecking it, and without homogenizing the works of art. I'll give you just two quick examples. We would never have had the great artist Ellen Atsui had we not been aware of the very local work that he has done in Africa. And I just read a piece by Dan Cameron, some of you might know him, and he's been going down to Chile, to a very tiny island in Chile, and has found groups of artists working together, making really creative and collaborative work. And again, he argues that we need to pay attention to the local as well and not necessarily turn it into a globalized phenomenon. So I'd like to take that value, number 5, of globalization, say, yes, let's keep going there. Let's be respectful of the global, but also let's make sure we don't lose the local along the way. We don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. The 6th quality or value that we thought was so terribly important was creativity and experimentation. And clearly, we're going to have to nuance that value to be sure that we know how to incorporate the digital, the NFTs, the immersive art, which is becoming so popular right now. I'd like to add a word of caution. I'm sure you all know that Van Gogh has made it into the immersive art world. People walk into Van Gogh's in a room that will be completely surrounding them. To some extent, I would argue that that is no longer a Van Gogh. It's kind of cheapening the idea that of what a Van Gogh painting was. But the means to do that has become a tool, una herramienta, for creating new work and experimenting with new work. So what I hope we see from the creativity and experimentation value, speaking about NFTs and speaking about the digital, is that these become tools so that our most creative artists can bring us into new worlds. We don't need to go back into Van Gogh. We need to go forward into the new artists that we're going to find as we expand our sites both globally and locally. So let's argue for creativity and experimentation using new means, not just to recapitulate the past, but to really come up with some fresh new ideas. The 7th of the values that was important to us was the creation of new alliances. This becomes even more important now than ever. In this book, one of the things that Graciela wrote about was the importance of creating interdisciplinary alliances. And I think that is going to be extremely important now that the disciplines in all of our universities are breaking down. We need to be able to create new alliances among areas of knowledge. We now call them knowledges, not just knowledge. And that's going to be terribly important. But we're going to have to create social alliances. We're going to have to create alliances among different kinds of museums. History museums, anthropology museums, art museums, gardens. We can't be living in these kinds of separated ideas of what museums are. I believe that we have to be porous in a new way. We need to be able to even examine what our rules and our ethics are about how museums can overlap, because the world and art never developed really in isolations and in isolated boxes. So our most creative parts will be when we recognize the largest humanity of the arts and history and sciences. The sciences are, I think, are way ahead of us in the way on this, but we need to make sure that these new alliances are created. The 8th of our 10 values was authentic experience. And I think it's really pretty obvious that the issue around authenticity has opened up. What is authentic? Is an NFT authentic? Again, I'm going to look to Marifer to talk to us a little bit more about it. I think it's incredibly important that these directors who are producing the NFTs in order to create revenues are making sure that they sign their own name or their institution's name on the back of, well, digitally on the NFT. So it's not mistaken to be an authentic Turner or Rembrandt or whatever. It is something else. And I think, again, it is upon us now. It is important that we do try to examine what is an authentic experience. We have museums that are just exploring, as I said, in both Galicia and Seattle and all over the world. Is it authentic to walk into a museum that doesn't exist architecturally or not? And I think that we need to ask those questions, and they're fair questions to ask. The 9th value was generation and the dissemination of knowledge. I would argue that that is exactly as it always was. There may be different ways to do it. We will do it through digital means. Whatever comes our way as an avenue, as a portal for disseminating knowledge. If museums do not take that responsibility for being a place from which knowledge is made and nurtured, then we are just another shopping mall. So I, again, would argue that that's very important. And of course, the 10th value, which was communication, that's been a complete revolution. We have social media. We have ways of communicating what we're doing that we didn't have 15 years ago. And I think that it becomes extremely important. And I think that there has to be a value added to it. We have to be very careful that whatever we're communicating is honest and transparent and true, because there's a lot of trouble that's being made, of course, by the opposite. So what I'd like to end with is just a sentence, a quotation from our book, which is just 2 sentences long, and then we'll open it up to Marifer. I think museum leaders need to be conducting an ongoing argument for continued support from society, because the museum provides a good for society. This is the good that makes its visitors experience their lives as better and richer than they would be if the museum did not exist for them. It's kind of simple, and yet so very complicated. People who come to museums, whether really, authentically, digitally, concretely, they need to feel that they are richer human beings for having experienced what it is that we have to offer. If they don't feel that way, then we're not doing our job. And with that, I think it's time for me to turn it over to the next speaker, right, Graciela?
Sí, Selma. Y bueno, después de este decálogo, de veras, qué lucidez, qué profundidad. Eres rigurosa y más. Pero ahora quisiera que escucháramos a Marifer, que Selma tuvo esta idea de invitarla, y me parece muy bien porque ella nos va a hablar de una experiencia totalmente diferente y una manera totalmente, no diría yo que opuesta, sino diferente de concebir el espacio museal. Entonces, Marifer, bienvenida con nosotros.
Gracias. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to share my screen. So just as an overview, I'm going to mention just what cryptocurrency and NFTs are. And so cryptocurrency is specifically a digital currency where all of the tokens are valued at the same price at the same time. So they can fluctuate day to day, but all of the coins continue to be at the same value. NFTs, on the other hand, are unique tokens where a value is assigned to them, and in reality, you can buy many things, not just digital art with NFTs. NFTs are really more the certificate of ownership. And they've been around for a decade now, really. But they really came into popularity with Beeple selling his artwork for 69 million at Christie's. This created an absolute revolution in how people thought of art and digital art purchasing and even selling their own art. And it's important to note that there's a difference between digital art and NFTs. It's not an interchangeable name. And as many of us know, digital art has been around since the 80s mostly, especially with the creation of Mac Paint, where people were given the tools to create their own art. Another term to keep in mind is minting, and that is when you create or produce the blockchain information that holds the NFT. This is a very important point to remember because minting takes an extreme amount of energy from a computer to the point where many artists have been deterring from creating NFTs because of the environmental impact that has to be made in order to actually be a part of this platform. And this is just the image of people that was spread all over when he sold this artwork at Christie's, just to refresh your memory. And I would like to briefly point out the evolution of museums as a typology and as an institution within culture, more specifically European culture. So as many of us may know, these collections began as personal explorations with these curiosity cabinets where everyone was collecting for personal experience. And they began to evolve into these French salons where they began to have a mission statement and a purpose to serve the public. This is really a turning point, and it forms what we now know as museums and what turns into the peak of the museum typology, such as the Altes Museum in Berlin. These museums are monuments to art, and they're built specifically for the art as opposed to buildings that happen to have art. So it's probably been a while since people within cities have built museums specifically like this one in Berlin, with such a calling to past cultures, because the present day museum, it has turned into a flexible white box where museums are coming in and out. They're no longer really permanent collections stagnant within the museum, but traveling, borrowed, and impermanent exhibitions. This kind of points to how people conceive museums today as more than a monument and more as a cathedral, a tourist attraction, a place of revenue, truly, within the city. And this dissolving of that monument idea of the castle that holds all of the art has dissolved further with the questioning and the scrutiny that museums were held under during the pandemic, more specifically. Here in the United States, Black Lives Matter began questioning a lot of these museums and their colonialist ideals. And with the introduction of the museums putting their work, all of their works on their websites in order for people to browse through them and have that same cultural connection, it brought to mind the questions of why we need this physical space. Why can't we just look at art on a computer? Why can't everything be free and online? Why are we paying admission into these museums? That, again, was compounded by the introduction of NFTs. And this specifically is a gallery in Los Angeles where they exclusively sell NFT digital art. And it's one of the conversation points that has been coming up a lot of why would you buy art that belongs in a screen, that lives in your computer, lives on your phone. But it's that same argument with many other pieces of art, like that value of having a curated space, a display area within a narrative still holds a lot of value. And I encourage everyone here, if you get the chance to see this digital art at a gallery or at a museum, to kind of understand how that intangible value still remains. So really, we're considering if this is just another medium that we're adding on to the already existing museums, all of these contemporary museums, or is this really something that is going to absolutely flip our conceptions of museums and how we expect to be spoken to and interacting with these institutions. So just a quick point, there are a few benefits and of course cons to carrying NFT collections. A really big benefit would be the art storage. So as many museums have these huge problems with art storage, it's extremely expensive and space consuming, and most of their art is in storage most of the time. This is really solved by just the existence of digital media, where the storage does not have to be air conditioned and controlled spaces, as most museums have to preserve all of this art. There's also the financial implications, as people continue to scrutinize cryptocurrency and its value and how maybe feeble it can be in gaining and losing value day to day. Like it's still a question that's constantly being asked about the longevity of this currency, and if 20 years, maybe even 5 years down the line, it's still going to be a valuable asset to maintain. And with these institutions that I would say are very vulnerable, especially as we saw during the pandemic, is it a sound investment to make, really? And going back to Selma's point about relevance and creativity and experimentation, the museum still has an absolute power over the community where it resides in creating an anchor, a cultural anchor that unites a community and brings a huge amount of value within that space. So in my research and exploring this back and forth between professors and colleagues, it's undeniable that museums have value and that they still have a role to play in our society. Whether or not people still enjoy it or still believe that it's in agreement with its own mission statement is something else. I think it's a discussion that could go on for ages, but that need to curate and display still exists, whether or not it's digital or physical, and whether or not we believe that it's relevant.
But,
So with this, I hand it back to Graciela.
no, continúa, Marifer, por favor.
Sé ¿qué más quieres que platique?
No, bueno, pues ya terminaste. Mira, esta conversación, desde que la tuvimos, me inquieta muchísimo. Yo entiendo que se ha revolucionado el mundo del coleccionismo con este tipo de arte, con el arte digital o con los NFT. Hay una suerte de accesibilidad o no estoy tan segura que hay una accesibilidad. Ya está en las ferias, acaba de estar en Sonamaco, están las subastas, Sotheby's. Lo que platicaba Selma del British Museum, a mí me causa horror en lo personal. Es como, yo no sé si el MUNAL vaya a incursionar y vaya a hacer NFT de los José María Velasco, o si el MUAC vaya a abrir una línea de su colección, no lo sé. Yo lo que sí considero, y ahí quiero que Selma me ayude y Marifer también, que estos valores trascendentes, inspiradores de los que está armando Selma, no los encuentro en los FIT, no encuentro la justicia cultural, no encuentro esta parte de la relevancia. Es accesible a todos los que puedan comprar. Desde mi presidente de patronato, que ya tiene los tokens, hasta creo que Lucía Amelian, quien es productora de la Cátedra, ya tiene también. Depende del dinero que tengas y de la cantidad que quieras, de tu deseo de acumular, desde mi punto de vista. Pero esta parte sensorial, esta parte perceptual, esta parte creativa, no la encuentro, no sé, digan ustedes, Marifer, Selma, ¿qué piensas de esto? Pues, entiendo que puede ser divertido para las nuevas generaciones, que hay un boom, que hay una burbuja de mercado, pero esta parte inspiradora de la que Selma hablaba, no la encuentro en los FT. ¿Tú qué dices?
I think there's 2 points to.
Okay, I'll be happy to start the conversation, and I hope that.
Comienza la Selma, sí.
Okay, and then Marifer will follow.
Sure.
I think it would be really disingenuous to think about the NFTs that our great art museums are creating are anything but a cynical attempt to get in revenue. There's no way that we can say that seeing a William Turner watercolor, seeing it as an NFT, which you get to own, but you don't own the watercolor, it's not going to be the experience of the inspiration that a unique work of art that came from the artist's hands will be. It's not going to be that. It will be something else. And it might be something that saves the collections. I don't know, because of a stream of money, because people have always bought reproductions, right? I mean, it's in the nature of museums to create reproductions, and people buy them and they put them up on their walls and they think they have a souvenir, a memory, but they don't think that they have the thing. They don't think that they have the authentic thing. And I think that there's some argument out there that this is also a work of art, that this is also somehow or another the thing. And I think we have to hold the boundary. We have to hold the fort and say, no. This is a way of making money. Whether it's cryptocurrency or whether it's dollars or whatever it is, it's a way of making money. The only thing that I think that we also have to face is that there will be ways of using and making NFTs and having NFTs that can ultimately be very creative and will ultimately create their own kinds of museums and their own inspirational and aspirational qualities. But I think that we're talking about a kind of a fooling of the public when we say that when you buy the Turner, the NFT for the Turner or whatever, that you're somehow or another getting an artistic experience. You're not. You're getting a financial transaction. And maybe Marifer, again, from Marifer and her generation, this is natural. This is I assume correct. I'd love to hear what you have to say, Marifer, and I'm so happy that you're with us, because it's important that we hear how you respond to this, both and make the distinction between old master museums and using the NFTs as creating a revenue stream, the possibilities for creativity in the future. Also, I hope, Marifer, that you can talk about architecture a little bit. This is something that we talked about initially when we first, is the new museum in Galicia, is that going to be a place at all? Or is it all about a kind of a digital experience? So it would be lovely if you could bring your generation's approach to all of this. I'd love to hear it.
Yes, so I think that one of the points that I would like to make is this, the intangibility that we keep touching on, and how I think a lot of, there's a big generational gap in understanding the value of NFTs. And I think that museums reselling pieces of old masters is a push for people to understand how it can be valued in art. But really, I more strongly believe in the idea of selling new digital art with this network, because it is really, I think, where the next phase of art is coming into. So in talking with people at the NFT gallery, it's quite a point that bothers them, that definition difference between NFT and digital art. So really, NFTs created a huge market for digital art to be created, sold, and just be considered as a fine art, where before, especially before these last 3 years, digital art was seen as something of less merit, I would say.
Excuse me, Marifer, one thing about that point precisely, my understanding is that before NFTs, when original digital art was produced, it could be stolen, hacked, it could be in some way appropriated, but the NFT creates a kind of an ownership possibility that protects the creation of the digital art. Is that correct?
I mean, just with, like you've said, with normal art, with a painting, people can make reproductions, people can steal it just as much as they can steal a digital file. But that sole ownership, the certificate, is what maintains you as the owner. It's really like insurance. So even if you do get hacked, you are still the owner.
So it's even a financial transaction still.
It's absolutely a financial transaction. And I think it's quite naive of us to say that art is not a financial entity. Because to many people, that is what it is. It's a thing that holds money, and you create these museums to kind of find a loophole in how to keep and have taxes.
Marifer y Selma, yo no quisiera polemizar, pero a mí de veras que es un tema que me inquieta. Tan me inquieta que lo vamos a incluir la palabra NFT en el vocabulario que estamos haciendo de nombrar la gestión cultural contemporánea. Ya no podemos obviar que existen. Pero a ver, este tipo de transacción tiene que ser en criptomoneda. ¿Así es? Bueno, entonces eso en principio es una barrera para la accesibilidad. ¿Quién puede manejar la criptomoneda? Una pequeña parte de la población. Y tienes que tener dispositivos además. No es como un museo que todos pueden entrar, todos pueden acceder a la experiencia. Y no estoy hablando de Old Masters, no estoy hablando de los museos tradicionales, puedo hablar del Museo de Arte Contemporáneo, puedo hablar del ECO, puedo hablar del MUAC. Todos pueden entrar. En cambio, los NFT, solo una pequeña parte de la población tiene acceso. Entonces, eso a mí me inquieta muchísimo, porque yo creo en los museos, creo que los museos cambian vidas, como Selma, que tú no eres el mismo después de tener una experiencia museal, o puedes no ser el mismo. Pero también a mí me inquieta mucho el problema de la accesibilidad y de la inclusión. Creo que esto está hecho para, si me equivoco, díganme, para una pequeña o una parte reducida de la población. Díganme si estoy bien o estoy pensando rookie pensamiento.
I think that comparing NFTs to museums is quite a leap, because NFT, like we mentioned, is the currency, it's the transaction. What the owner chooses to do with the art is up to them. The owners of the art in Moak, in the Broad, wherever you think, whatever museum you're thinking, are choosing to display this art to the public. So whether or not it's an NFT is, I think, irrelevant in the displaying of it, because it's being displayed to the public in whatever medium it is. I also agree that there's a great value to that curation and that sharing with the public. Again, the NFT side of it is really more of the financial part, and I think that that's a definition that I need to make a little bit clearer. And with accessibility, it's complicated to kind of grasp, but really it's just another form of currency. Just as much as you would have to buy, I don't know, if you wanted to buy a Picasso and they told you, okay, well, you have to pay in euros, then you have to make that exchange from dollars to euros, pesos to euros, whatever it is. It's still that change in currency, but with online banking, as most people, I think, use the bank online. I don't know if many people still go to the bank every week, but it's just another app on your phone. It's that extension of your money. I think there's more of a cultural barrier, mental inaccessibility, but I don't think that truly.
No creo que sea una barrera cultural. ¿Tú qué piensas, Selma?
Well, I think that it may be generational. It may very well be generational, because for me, the idea of the cryptocurrency that you have to be able to grasp is so complicated. And I think it is exclusionary. I think it really is exclusionary.
Claro.
And I think that that's a great portion of the population. I mean, it's really, I think it seems when you're in it and having the conversations, Marifer, that I'm sure that you have in class or among students, that the idea of the cryptocurrency and the NFTs seem in some way to be democratizing the art experience. But for an awful lot of museum goers, it's another layer it's another barrier to understand. To understand that, and it feels like it's kind of when it's dealing with the reproduction of works of art, which is what it is, and then having people buy them, I imagine, with cryptocurrency, and thinking that they have a work of art, it feels like it's taking advantage of people, because this is a way of really just raking in the revenues, and I think those of us who are in museums know that. But we do have to make a distinction, and I think, Marifer, you're struggling with trying to make us accept that there's a distinction between making digital art, which has been made for decades, or at least a decade and a half or whatever now, and then what happens with is it sold as an NFT?
Yes.
The original. So then that means that somebody has to buy it with the cryptocurrency.
Claro.
And that's a barrier to people
absolutamente
becoming a part of the art world. It's scary. It really is. So could you talk about...
Acaba, Selma, y luego te quiero decir, no. Pero en países como el nuestro, tú eres mexicana o viviste en México, conoces el tipo de población, entonces tiene que ser excluyente por naturaleza. Cuando estamos viendo, tuvimos una conversación hace un momento con el Museo de Historia, la renovación del Museo de Historia Natural, que es en Chapultepec, que cuesta $1.50 la entrada. Entonces ahora quieres manejar criptomoneda, es excluyente. Tal vez en algunos países no, pero como en el nuestro es totalmente excluyente. Selma, ¿qué piensan? A ver, Marifer, ¿no piensas que es excluyente?
Bueno, yo por lo que I think it's exclusionary, so I think we need to have an argument. Well, I don't even know what Marifer believes. She's reporting to us. I don't think she's making the case for it, and I think we need to know what's out there. So expand, Marifer, expand, like how would you enter a museum that was a purely digital art and AI museum?
Mhm.
Would there be a building? Would you have to pay in cryptocurrency? Would you have to, because it's very scary to most people in the world. It's just a small elite that can kind of grasp this right now.
Right, which is why I think there's more of like a cultural barrier, I think, than a true problem of accessibility. And it's interesting because people, when they heard of NFTs and they heard of museums making their collections digital, so you could watch them all on your computer, people thought, well, the major reaction was, this is so much more accessible than a museum. And it is different in both countries, I say, in the United States than in Mexico. But just thinking about someone who lives in the middle of Kansas, I don't think that they're going to be able to go to the Met. Just drive up to the Met, pay the $25 entrance fee, and look at all the art. That, to a lot of Americans especially, seems like a much greater barrier than the idea of NFTs or digital art. And I do think that they're just grasping the idea of NFTs is a hurdle. I know it took me a while, and it just made me go back and forth between finance, which I never bothered to look at. But when it's affecting our world as artists, as creators, I had to pay attention. So I think that it's an interesting argument to make about accessibility. And my argument when people said that, oh, digital art is so much more accessible, coming from a country where most people don't have a smartphone, to me, it seems a lot less accessible to have museums live online. But I understand that there's a cultural difference between middle America with laptops in their homes than rural Mexico, that to them it's a lot more accessible to get on a bus and go to a public museum than to get access to a computer and sit in front of it for hours.
Having been born and raised in Chicago in middle America, I think that there's an unfairness about that, really, because I think that what most in the beginning, when we had the digital art, people from the museums were digitizing their collections and putting that on. A lot of us were really afraid that would keep people from going to museums, that it would stand in for a museum, that it would substitute for a museum. And I think we found that it was very much different. I think we found that what it did was create a taste for the authentic. It created an appetite to be able to go to the museums. And there are museums scattered, great museums scattered all over, let's say, the Midwest. It has to be such a big journey or such a big leap. And I think we found that our museums' attendance numbers did not go down because of digital art. It became a tool, a portal, but still there was an understanding or a feeling that there was something original, there was a value in the original. And maybe it would mean they just go to their local Kansas museum or whatever, but in Kansas, there are a lot of good museums. There are really good museums in Kansas. So I think that we have to be very careful. I don't think the difference is as large between Mexico and most of America, because most of America is not New York City.
Right.
And I think that there is a very big angst, a big anguish, a big concern about how you approach this new kind of way of presenting art, and big suspicion throughout most of America. And so I think we have to really try to think of the unintended consequences, which might be a kind of alienation rather than an invitation. I don't know.
Sí. Fíjate, Selma, cuando mi presidente de patronato del MOAC me propuso hace no mucho abrir una parte de la colección NFT, me causó muchísima ansiedad, Y yo le pregunté a la directora, ahorita Julio García Murillo, que está subdirector de programas públicos del MOA, que nos acompaña, le pregunté si quería abrir una nueva rama de la colección. No sé todavía si la quiere abrir. Comprendo perfectamente que tal vez sea el futuro. No podemos obviar esa realidad, pero también pienso como tú que esta burbuja de coleccionismo de arte digital, pues posiblemente nada más sea una burbuja, el crypto art, una burbuja de mercado, me parece. No podría yo decirte si es el futuro o no lo es.
I do think that the bubble is a bubble and it might pop very soon. That art might be vastly overvalued right now in terms of NFTs and digital art. But with another point of accessibility, a lot of artists themselves were elated with the idea of NFTs because they get the opportunity to sell the art themselves and have someone buy it directly in a much more globalized way without having to go through Sotheby's and Christie's. And like I said before, it created a really big market. Whether or not it's vastly overvalued or not, I think we'll find out soon enough. But there was another point someone asked, but you can keep going, Selma, if you.
Right, and I'd like you to, if we have a little bit of time, what I'd love is if you could walk us through the idea of, let's say, we have two artist friends. One is an artist who works in digital art. He's making beautiful digital art. The other is a more traditional artist making fabulous art, but by painting. Walk us through the value of the NFT to each of them. The artist who is making the digital art, how he or she can then sell or have a transaction with the NFT. Does that person get to keep their art? And it's just the NFT that's out there as a kind of souvenir, kind of memory of the art itself. But what does the real painter do? What happens with your friend, the painter who paints a beautiful painting? How does that person use the NFT? And have it be better for them as an artist, to make more money, to have more access, more. What's the value to each of those two different kinds of artists?
Right. So another level of complication. NFTs, when they're sold, they are sold, but the artist continues to make revenue from it. So it's almost like when you sell a book license and you continue to make money off of the reselling every time it's being resold. When you sell your painting, you are completely giving it away to them, unless there's some kind of contractual thing that includes that revenue going back directly to the artist. So that's one of the bigger things where artists were very excited about having the money that the painting continues, the digital art continues to make.
But the collector then never has the physical art. The collector does not have the physical art. The painter keeps the physical art, sells the NFTs, the buyer has the NFT, and the buyer can then resell the NFT, but I guess money still goes back to the artist, right? I mean,
no.
Yes.
No. Because remember, in the olden days, yesterday, remember, artists, even when they sell their work, they retain the copyright. They always have the right. They still so that if there were reproductions, I mean, we cannot even, Graciela and I, if we make a catalog, we cannot reproduce the work of art without the permission of the artist, and we have to pay them something, usually, or whatever the deal is. And there are laws in different states that mean that say that when a work of art is resold, that the artist needs to get something back from that. So this idea is only technological. It's not that the idea that an artist retains the right to the reproduction of the work of art is a new idea. It's
right, think that it's especially for up and coming artists, it's seen as a greater benefit because the contracts might not be as generous as, say, when you buy something from Kusama, where that truly is a lot more, it's taken a lot more seriously in terms of copyright and reselling value and all of that. And with an emerging artist, I think that they're given a lot more power, which is why emerging artists are so excited about this NFT market.
So would they do that all themselves, Marifer? You just make a digital art, an immersion, a room immersion or something of a fabulous thing. Do you just put it on social media and hope that the world comes to you and then you can NFT it in as much as you can? Or are there galleries that will be intermediaries still that will manage that for you and take a piece of the money as well? Because artists often can't manage all of that, the making of the art and the selling of the art and the distributing of the art and the marketing of the art and all of that. So how does that work in the real world?
Well, I think it's less hands-on to sell NFT directly, like as a personal artist, and you sell it through NFT, the NFT platform. That is a lot less hands-on than going and trying to sell it to patrons. So I think it's just the almost like the just the technology, because of its popularity and because of the ease with which people can sell, has become very desired by these artists. But still, that there are NFT galleries connecting artists to buyers, of course, and
so it will become in its own way monetized and commoditized as much as it'll just be a different. I think that's basically my point. Nothing really changes. It's just the means to be able to
that's
do it.
Right, and that's I think something people kept criticizing. A lot of NFT art right now, art is a strong word, is really just another holding in cryptocurrency that looks like a kitten, that looks like a flower, a 4-bit flower.
Yeah.
But it's really just holding for money. And critiquing that as high art is, I think, a disservice to art. But again, the NFT market created a demand for digital art.
Right.
And that's the exciting part. NFTs have done nothing in terms of making the technology better, as in like Adobe is suddenly so much cooler. There's another medium. It's the same medium that was here in the past. I think it's been 3-4 decades. It's really just the market and the sellability.
Yeah.
Selma, yo creo que hay muchísimas preguntas del público. Yo quisiera, Julio García Murillo, después de esta sesión creo que vamos a necesitar una más, porque verdaderamente el decálogo me conmovió, porque me conmovió ese decálogo. Yo creo en ese decálogo 100%. Absolutamente toda la bondad del museo, todo lo que puede cambiar la vida de una persona y de la humanidad. Pero lo que Marifer nos expuso también es una realidad, y es una realidad que no podemos obviar, sobre todo cuando nuestra realidad estuvo 2 años en el mundo digital, era la única realidad. Entonces creo que dejaste muchas preguntas más que respuestas. Julio, si quieres, te veo a ti muy tú que estás en generación intermedia, no eres ni Marifer, ni Selma, ni yo, una generación intermedia, ¿qué piensas tú?
Bueno, además de una generación intermedia, cómplice en muchos sentidos también de quienes estamos aquí, en muchas ideas. Pero yo saltaría en defensa de ciertas cosas que ha articulado Marifer, porque creo que en el fondo se corresponden con nociones clave que Selma planteaba en el decálogo. Yo creo que la pregunta que ha cruzado esta conversación y que también articula muchas de las preguntas que tenemos del público es en torno al valor o los valores del museo, que es el punto desde el que iniciaste, Selma, y que de alguna manera aquí quisiera hacer un juego de estas malas traducciones a veces entre inglés y español, de pensar que estamos imaginando el valor desde una tradición económico-política muy concreta en donde podemos ver valores de uso y valores de cambio de cosas, pero también el valor en un sentido de asset. ¿Cuáles son los assets del museo? En ese sentido, creo que una cosa clave no es tanto preguntarnos en el carácter, voy a ocupar una de esas palabras esdrújulas, en el carácter ontológico del NFT. No creo que sea realmente interesante pensar, claro que es interesante pensarlo, pero en relación con los museos no es solo interesante ver qué sucede cuando se adquiere un NFT, sino más bien qué posibilidades tiene un NFT al entrar al museo de también jugar una lógica de acceso abierto. Porque yo creo que ahí es donde se están jugando distintas tensiones de lo que ya se articulaba en torno a la justicia cultural. Ahorita tenemos cierta percepción de que las obras en las bodegas son más reales de que las obras con un certificado digital, pero las reproducciones de ambas circulan, la ciencia y el conocimiento, los saberes sobre ambas empezarán a circular, y más bien también es el riesgo de los otros costos que tienen las criptomonedas, ¿no? El costo que tiene en términos ecológicos, el minting, el saber que no es abstracto, que son bases de datos, que son bodegas gigantes con ordenadores, que son cables que cruzan el Atlántico con fibra de vidrio, y que esas son las nuevas bodegas también. A partir de ahí, quisiera articular algunas de las preguntas que lanza el público, que tuvimos muchísimas, pero las sinteticé en tres. A lo largo bueno, en la participación de nuestros usuarios, de nuestra audiencia, hubieron aclaraciones también sobre el NFT, ¿no? Tener claridad que es un certificado de autentificación y que de una forma u otra son las élites las que coleccionan este tipo de arte. Pero bueno, una de las preguntas que nos hacían, y yo creo que aquí toca tanto a Selma como a Marifer, es ¿cuál es la vigencia de la práctica curatorial frente a estas nuevas posibilidades digitales? Esa es una de las preguntas que nos lanzaban, ni siquiera la dejo abierta para escuchar sus respuestas, y ahorita les planteo las otras dos preguntas que tenemos.
This is a tough question, Julio. I do believe that there is some respect that comes from our various communities about the accumulation of knowledge that curators have after going to university for 12 years or what, getting their doctorates, doing whatever they have to do. And I think that there is always going to be a hope that there will be a figure in society that can gather. Remember, we've been talking about the works of art in storage, right? 95% of the works in most museums is in storage. It takes a curator to be able to go through all that work, because it's never going to all be on display, except maybe digitally, and to be able to tell a story about it, to be able to weave it together, to have a narrative, to be able to pursue historical justice about the telling of those stories. I do believe that many of our curators have been exclusionary. I think many of our curators have, in a way, sort of kept secret how they come to telling the stories, or have a very elitist way of telling the stories. And I think we have to admit That's going to have to change. There's going to have to be a more open, and I think it's on the way. I think the pipelines of other ways of telling the stories and giving value to what we have, I think that that's changing. I think we can't deny that it's changing. So I think it's going to be, there's going to always be a need for somebody who knows more than we all know in society, in our museums, who's going to be able to tell that story. I'm hoping that we will be able to organize our museums in such a way that we perhaps have more town halls. We have more places where people can gather together so that they can share their histories, so that whoever becomes in charge, the curators, the educators, the various parts of our museums, the museum space, can be more informed by different ways of looking at our treasures that we have to share. That's got to happen. But I think that in the town hall, that the town hall will curate the exhibitions or make available, it's not going to work that way. It'll be chaos. It'll be like the truckers in Ottawa right now. It'll be everybody saying their own thing, and there'll be no weaving together of meaning, no meaning making. And I think museums are in the business of meaning making, not just the business of the business. I think they're in the business of meaning making. So I think that that's going to have to continue. But more openly, more fairly, more with more wisdom, because there has been a hoarding of the stories. So I'd like to say that I think that the democratizing is going to become not so much that everybody's going to have the same amount of power. That doesn't work. But it's going to be, the democratizing is going to be in the opportunity to share the many ways of looking at the world that we live in, so that those who are then ultimately responsible for it can have more information, so that what they produce will be more in the level of wisdom rather than just a specific knowledge. Marifer, could you speak to that a little bit?
I have more of a parallel point. So in talking to the NFT galleries, the digital galleries, they brought up a point that I thought, especially as an architecture student, that was very interesting. So the screens that they use to display that digital NFT art are set in place. The frames are set in the wall. Certain dimensions are there. And either the artist or the curator have to negotiate with those dimensions in order to put the art in that screen, according to how they want the people to walk through the space. And that to me brings up a very interesting problem, where in traditional art, it's a sin to cut up a canvas to make it fit, right? But this is what they're doing in digital art over and over again, reformatting their art to fit these screens. And that's another level of curation that needs to be considered, I think, in this new medium that we're looking at, the medium of the screen. So I also think that there's a unique value having to have made digital art for these past 2 years instead of printed art like we usually do in school. You realize how different it is to make art for either of these mediums, and how much skill there is to actually approach it the right way. And again, as the curator, there's another level of knowledge and intricacy that goes into it, as in actually curating the digital gallery, the digital museum in a physical space. I just thought that was very interesting. With these extremely expensive screens, you still need to reformat everything. So
creo que ambas tocan puntos que pueden ayudarnos a abrir más la conversación. Sin duda, el índice que marcas, Selma, en torno a cuál de alguna manera seguiría siendo el negocio del museo, ¿no? El negocio del significado, de business of meaning, como lo articulas. Y también la forma en la que Marifer planteas no solo estos temas infraestructurales, que llegan a ser, por un lado, fascinantes en términos tecnológicos, y por otro lado nos pueden espantar mucho, ¿no? Por los medios que implican. Pero que también nos hacen caer en cuenta que tal vez, aunque el museo se puede quedar con el negocio del significado, pero la práctica curatorial está mucho más extendida de lo que creemos. Está operando en la cantidad de las formas que tenemos que encontrar para ordenar nuestra saturación de información cotidiana, nuestra saturación de elementos con los que debemos de rodearnos para poder sobrevivir. Pues es como un tema en el que la curaduría también se ha metido en la vida cotidiana, ¿no? Como una necesidad crítica, no como una selección arbitraria. Y tal vez esto va hacia una de las segundas preguntas sintéticas que planteamos aquí, o que plantea nuestra audiencia. Y es justo una tensión entre justicia social y justicia cultural, pero más o menos situada en el campo específico de museos y digitalidad. Nuestra audiencia abrazó las dos conferencias y están pensando desde la confrontación y tensión también que articuló. Entonces, una de las preguntas que abren de nuevo es cómo pensar o sea, qué perspectivas hay para lograr justicia cultural específica en este campo. Y me gustaría hacer una aclaración que creo que fue clave en tu conferencia, Selma, que es, a los museos nos tocan algunas cosas. Nosotros no podemos encargarnos sobre sistemas de salud para distintos tipos de población, pero sí podemos jugar por mantener una noción de accesibilidad en torno a los significados que genera el museo. En ese sentido, creo que la conversación ya va avanzada. Voy a hacer como una pregunta específica a Marifer, si me lo permiten, y también Selma, lo que quieras articular será genial. Pero la pregunta específica es, ¿cómo podemos imaginar accesibilidad de NFTs en museos públicos? O sea, y no estoy pensando en momentos como de mayor elaboración teórica, sino qué estrategias tenemos. El museo empieza a coleccionar cierto tipo de objetos. ¿Cómo los vamos a distribuir? ¿Cómo los va a operar el museo? Siento que en la conversación ya plantearon muchas perspectivas, desde el momento de Turner, el museo haciendo NFTs como estrategia de fundraising, pero también hay otras formas también hipercríticas que en web están operando como formas de generar críticas sobre estas pues sí, tokens no fungibles, por traducirlo mal.
Tengo una pregunta sobre esa pregunta. Cuando dices NFTs, ¿te estás refiriendo como a los tokens que usaron para vender partes de artes maestros, o en realidad el arte digital que estamos viendo con como People y los otros artistas?
Creo que me refiero a ambos, porque ahí es donde está una pregunta clave del público, ¿no? Entre un tipo de manejo como decías, de venta de imágenes de grandes maestros, o también como una forma de trabajo habitual en artistas jóvenes, en artistas contemporáneos, porque tampoco es también restrictivo a edades.
Well, I think that, especially when we're talking about digital art, there could be a further level of accessibility, because as Selma and Graciela pointed out, when you see these paintings, these sculptures on the screen, there's just such a detachment from what it really is that it's hard to truly appreciate it. But with digital art, because it's made for screens, just the distribution of it in and of itself is more accessible. I still believe that there's even on top of that, a further value in curating and seeing it in these galleries and museums on these massive screens. That it's a quality that most of our laptops, most of our smartphones don't have, just because of the potency. But to go back to the NFTs regarding the masters, it's really, I think, a financial play. It's not really, unless they own the actual piece, I don't think that it has anything to do with the public. It's more, I would say, to get people excited about NFTs and having that possibility of ownership. And just like you might say, like, oh, I own like this amount of this company, and you get excited and you want to go see it. I think it's more of an incentive than something regarding accessibility and the public be like having a more direct association with the old masters NFT fragments.
Well, you know about Barnum and Bailey, who were the creators of the big circuses. And the thing that they said, or that Barnum said, was, there's a sucker born every minute. How could we translate that? Well, I hope our interpreter can, because it's a wonderful thing. This is bringing suckers into the art world, thinking that they own a piece of the masters in some way. And I think this will pass as other things happen. I do want to say one thing about the artists and how excited they are about this. Fortunately, I have a brother who's an artist, and he decided that he wanted to turn a book that he made that was made with digital art and landed up getting it into a digital file to turn it into an NFT. And I watched him as he struggled. He's just a kind of normal person. And he struggled trying to figure out how to deal with the cryptocurrency, how to get a wallet, a cryptocurrency wallet, how to make this thing happen. It has to be auctioned in a certain kind of a way. It's extremely complicated. And I think that a lot of artists, unless they're really technologically inclined and digitally inclined, are going to weary. They're going to get tired of it, because it is a lot of work. It's not like it's just so easy to get those copyrights, the money from the end. And then, of course, most of them don't sell. You hear about the things that do sell, but most of them don't sell. And so then again, there's a kind of sucker born every minute. The artists thinking that this will be easy for them to be able to get royalties and constant stream of income. It'll last while it lasts. And I sort of think that there's nothing wrong with museums building a wing or a gallery of art that will be digital art, where people can come and see it and gather and get away from their computer screens and be in the kinds of social situation that museums provide for us. I think that that's fine. But I think we shouldn't people will begin to take it as kind of normal after a while. And it's not going to be bringing in crowds and crowds of audience that we don't already have, I think.
No, es probable. Y uno de los casos que imaginaba a partir de algunas preguntas de nuestra audiencia era el caso de El Salvador, por ejemplo, ¿no? El Salvador como un país en el que desde hace un par de años y cada vez con mayor intensidad se ha abierto acceso al Bitcoin, luego ha creado su criptomoneda, y el presidente en ciertos círculos críticos es también interpretado como un criptoevangelista. Por la manera en la que plantea casi como la salvación económica del Salvador va a ser a partir de las criptomonedas. Y bueno, muchas personas críticas al proyecto plantean que no es como tal un tema de accesibilidad, sino más bien un tema de opacidad, lo que haría imposible que funcionara en un esquema como de Estado-Nación. Creo que estos casos también nos pueden ayudar para imaginar el lugar del museo desde este planteamiento que hacías, Marifer, como el museo o sea, el post-typology museum, y también desde qué nociones podemos hoy articular una especie de museo post-nacional, cuando por otro lado, en la mayoría de nuestros países hay un retorno como muy conservador y reaccionario en torno al nacionalismo, ¿no? Y una mirada probablemente sesgada sobre el acceso a qué cosas deben de tener las audiencias. Definitivamente nos quedan muchísimas preguntas, pero tal vez la última va hacia las brechas, ¿no? El público se ha preguntado por las brechas que se abren. Más que brechas, quisiera aquí retomar también los puentes a los que alude Selma, también en el decálogo. Con este horizonte como situado en diferentes lugares, con las tensiones nacionales, globales, las formas de operación económica y las formas de operación también de los museos. Pues esta sería como una pregunta de cierre. ¿Qué puentes podemos construir para que estas brechas, que se van a hacer más anchas, por lo menos tengan puntos de contacto?
Selmita, tú. No, yo quisiera que Marifer y Selma cerrara la sesión, por favor.
I think the only way that we're going to close these gaps is to continue talking about it as we're doing today. I think that bridging the generations is the most important thing that we can do. Marifer's generation is very enthusiastic about the whole issue of digital art and NFTs, understanding that they're very different things, but that they feed into each other. There's a resistance in a more conservative generation that's older, that is already deeply involved with museums, as they are and as they're becoming more open, less monumentalized, more democratized places every day. And I think maybe the one way we can create bridges is to take what we're doing now among professionals, because we all came here to talk about this particular subject and we have experience and we have backgrounds and all of that. And again, if we can open up these discussions to the more interested publics that maybe don't have all that experience, wisdom, and training and education, and mix it up a little bit so that we can talk to each other. I'm extremely grateful that Marifer joined us, because this is an opening, and it's through the openings, through the portals, that we create the bridges. So I think we're on the way. We just have to keep doing it and make it more inclusive and larger.
Muchas gracias, Selmita. Muchas gracias. Y mira, realmente tú diseñaste esta sesión. Creo que tú diseñaste esta sesión. Muchas gracias, Selma. Es un honor siempre estar contigo. Y creo que fue un acierto invitar a Marifer. De veras que esta nueva palabra NFT va a estar en el nuevo vocabulario que vamos a hacer. Muchísimas gracias. Siempre es inspirador hablar contigo. Y bueno, con Marifer ya aprendí muchas cosas hoy. Julio, hiciste un gran cierre, un grande resumen de las preguntas y los invitamos mañana. Mañana es el segundo día, va a estar dedicado al verbo mediar. Nuestra primera conferencia va a ser a las 10 de la mañana. Gestionar cultura y transitar la academia desde la disidencia y la perspectiva de género. Estará con nosotros Mariana Perkovich, ella es directora de teatro y dramaturga, y va a comentarlo Sandra Lorenzano, directora de Cultura y Comunicación de la Coordinación para la Igualdad de Género. Recuerden ustedes que este programa, bueno, tiene una orientación de género muy marcada. Selma, gurusa de mi amor, Marifer, ya nos pidieron bibliografía, entonces creo que todos aprendimos de esta sesión. Muchísimas gracias, Julio, y vamos a continuar. Mire, aquí dicen que las dos participaciones las felicitan y aportaron muchísimo a los profesionales de museo. Hasta mañana, nos vemos a las 10 de la mañana por la Liga de la Cátedra Inés Amor. Gracias, Julio. Gracias, equipo. Nos vemos mañana.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.